Welcome to Powerssquared, Raw and Real. This is number 32, and this is number 3 on our continuing saga of writing and religion. I'm M.A. Powers.
And I'm JL Powers.
I'm here in Maine,
And
and you're back in California, aren't you?
I'm back in California. Yep.
Great. Well, so last week we started to kind of get into this evangelical culture in our teens, and I'm really curious about your you professed your faith and got baptized. Mostly, it seems like out of fear, but as a older child, and then you moved kind of into your, I think, your formative teen years, and I'm really curious about that. And then as a young adult in college and stuff, just your experience with Christianity and the things you're doing. I'm more interested today in talking to you about that. We can always come back to me later, but so
Okay.
let's start off around the age of 12-ish.
Okay. Well, so I think one important thing to mention, which we didn't mention last week, and this will really factor significantly into your story, but at the end of fourth grade, mom started homeschooling me. You had already been homeschooled for about a year.
Sure.
So I do think, although I don't want to necessarily focus on it in this particular episode, but homeschooling plays a big part in the culture that we were raised in, and particularly in the 80s, the other people that were homeschooling were all evangelical Christians, basically.
Right.
These days, it's a much more diverse movement, but at least in those days.
Sure.
So at the end of fourth grade, mom started homeschooling me. You were already being homeschooled.
Well, we're here, so let's talk about that. How do you think that affected you religiously? I'm just curious.
Well, I will say that aside from the religious part, I am extremely grateful that I was homeschooled. I was not safe at the school that I was in. I wasn't emotionally or physically safe. And I absolutely feel like I was rescued and needed to be rescued, and needed that. And so it kind of removed me from this this situation where I wasn't safe, and put me in a position where I was safe. Maybe not from the demons and
right.
all of that, but from shitty other kids.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to run away from your own head, right?
That's right.
But
That's
yeah,
right.
you can remove yourself from other people.
Right. And so aside from the religious stuff, that was important. And then I would say that from the perspective of, just a minute, I need to put my dogs away so that they're not barking this entire time.
Oh, great.
Talk.
I wish I had bumper music.
Yeah.
I could be like singing something or whistling, talking about it. So yes, it's interesting. We got into homeschooling. I don't know, partly probably because our mother was listening to James Dobbs and some of the other kind of titans of that neoconservative Christian movement back in the 80s, but and that marrying of conservatism with Christianity, which really started happening probably late 70s, but just like it really started to occur in the 80s, and then just became this whole political religious movement now where I think it's difficult to be an evangelical and not be a conservative Christian. It's just like they're so married and so intertwined that politics and those movements, it's just really difficult. And so anyways, we were right in that movement, and so our parents started homeschooling me first, even though I was the youngest, because I had pneumonia twice and in 1 year, and I was sick and I just couldn't go to school. And so they were looking for alternatives. And so they started with me. But then I think the underpinnings, like my mother started looking about like, well, how do you homeschool? What do you homeschool? And all the other evangelicals who were homeschooling at the time kind of underpinned that. So here you go. We're back.
Okay, we're back to me. And I will say too, also for the record, and this is part of the raw and real thing, is that there's a question I want to return to for you at the end of this that has to do with last episode, but we'll return to that. I've written it down so I won't forget it. So okay. Homeschool and how it affected me religiously. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that happens when you're removed from maybe the public school environment on the one hand, but also just sort of general interactions with lots of people outside of Christianity on the other hand, which may or may not have anything to do with being homeschooled, is that you begin to see, you know, most of the people that are around you kind of have the same worldview. And actually, I think we tend to do this in our lives anyway. I think a lot of people tend to do this in their lives anyway. I actively resist that in my life as an adult, but I think that it's a natural tendency for people to try and surround themselves with like-minded people in their communities, whether that's politically or religiously or both. And so that's
economically in particular.
Sorry?
Economically in particular too.
Economically, oh yeah, that's a huge, huge thing. You know, wealthier people tend to associate mainly with wealthier people, middle class with middle class, working class with working class. Absolutely. And that's, I will say, something that mom and dad, maybe not religiously so much, but in terms of class dynamics, they always actively resisted that. We lived in a poor working class neighborhood, which, you know, is relatively diverse in terms of whether the people there are citizens or not citizens. And by not citizens, they might have been undocumented. They still live in that neighborhood, but when we were growing up, some of them were undocumented. Some of them were in the process of various stages of gaining citizenship. And some, of course, were citizens. But it was very working class and poverty stricken too, not just working class, but poverty stricken too.
Very much so.
Absolutely. And I don't think we should underestimate that. You know, some of my friends in high school, they were undocumented, and you know, they went to one of the churches that we went to and one of the youth groups that I went to. So religiously, there was a lot of similarities. But anyway, there were 6 of them. They were undocumented, and their mother worked as a maid for about $25 a day, and that was what they lived on. And they lived, I mean, when I say poverty stricken, like
right. No, we would drop people off at their house, and it was in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and it was an old adobe building that was falling down for the most part, but they kept it up as best as their means could.
Right. So, you know, mom and dad, I think, have always kind of resisted being segregated by class or by culture, right? They've never segregated themselves with other white Midwestern people or
in fact,
middle
class. Kind of actively not done that, like kind of shunned that.
Yeah. And so we didn't grow up, I wouldn't say we grew up in a monocultural or monoclass
sure, but everybody that we did interact with, the vast majority of them, whether they were wealthy or not wealthy, was through a religious context.
Exactly.
I would say. Almost exclusively homeschooling and religion. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think, you know, being then removed from the one segment of my life where I was being exposed to a lot of kids that may have been Catholic or may have been secular, did put me in this kind of monoculture of evangelicalism. It's really hard to talk about this without, you know, I mean, it was such a relief not to be in that situation because it was just not safe for me.
Right.
And so I feel so much gratitude to mom and dad for removing me from that, and to putting, and also just, I mean, the teachers were so awful, and you cannot underestimate how awful and damaging the teachers that I had in that school were.
Right.
I mean, I am absolutely certain that, I mean, my third grade teacher was abusive. I mean, he was just abusive, and I was terrified in that class. And the things he said to me that I totally believed as an 8-year-old. And meanwhile, I was being sexually bullied by the kids in my class. And so it was just this sort of all around awful situation. And my fourth grade teacher was a little bit better, but not much.
Sure.
And I reached a place where, in terms of being at all interested in learning or the world, and so, I feel this enormous gratitude on the one hand, because I really was saved from an awful situation. And there weren't better. So mom and dad did not have money to send us to private school. And they did send Eric, our older brother, for a little bit to a private school, but that was a bad situation for him too. So I don't think there were other good options. And homeschooling really was the best option. And I'm just so enormously relieved that I was. It taught me self-reliance, resilience, working on my own, meeting deadlines. When I started college at 16, I was completely prepared. And it doesn't mean that I had all the knowledge that maybe when I look back, I think, I was finishing high school. Maybe I should have had more biology knowledge or whatever, but I was completely prepared for college classes. I went in without a hitch. There were no issues. So on that token, there's just so much that I'm grateful for. But again, it did put me in this place of being segregated from anything other than kind of evangelical culture. And that is something that I can see how much it shaped the way I saw the world. And I remember thinking when I was 12, 13, 14, that, if you weren't a Christian, you couldn't know what the concept of love was. You didn't know what love was if you weren't a Christian, which is such a horrible thing to think about.
Sure.
Basically everybody outside,
right.
However, I don't know what percentage of the world is not evangelical Christian, but it's pretty high. So that's really a terrible thing to think about, well over half the world, probably more like 80% of the world, 90% of the world. I don't even know, but
right. But even the concept of right and wrong, right? How did that affect you, through this religious concept, and anybody who was not within this sphere, like the idea of what's sin and what isn't, and what's right and what's wrong? How do you tell that, right? Do you understand what I'm asking? It's not just love. It was the whole concept. I believe we would kind of felt like, how could you have morality if you didn't believe in a God, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. Actually, I was in a conversation just last week with dear friends of mine that I've known forever and whom I love. But in the course of the conversation, and I was discussing, partly because we've been talking about this, but also it just came up. I was talking about, my deep concern that the way religious parents kind of, and this has come up in the last two things anyway, but the way religious parents kind of give their children a narrative that there's nothing else, no other way of understanding the world, or and that I feel like it's manipulative in getting kids into this kind of certain mindset. And they're deeply religious. And in fact, I've known them since my InterVarsity days. And at the end of towards the end of the conversation, the husband said, well, I just think that this is just, you're deeply relativistic. That's all there is to it. You have no moral what do you, where could you have a moral compass, right? And later, I didn't really respond to it at the time, but later I thought, just because I see problems with the way religious parents shape how their children go and see the world doesn't mean that I'm just a relativist or, you know, but that's precisely what you're talking about a little bit, is that isolated from other people who thought differently, I gained a lot of perceptions about them that turned out to be inaccurate later, as I learned. That it just created a real deficit of experience that would have widened my ability to understand humanity and the human condition, which, by the way, of course, Christians are deeply concerned about the human condition. But when you isolate yourself from, you know, all other people that think differently from you, then you don't actually really understand the human condition very adequately. I was on a panel in my early 20s, a homeschooling panel in El Paso, and the question, you know, there was a big crowd. There must have been a couple hundred people there, and there were 3 of us up on stage, as I recall, and all of us had been homeschooled. And the question was, you know, how were you prepared for college, or what should we be doing to prepare our children for college, etc. And I addressed this issue. I said, you know, when I went to college, I had not really hung out with people that were different. And so I kind of replicated that at college. I mostly stayed within InterVarsity Christian Fellowship with other people that were like-minded and thought like me. And I didn't make a lot of friends outside of that because I was afraid to. And a lot of evangelicals would say you should be, because look what happened when you did break through those barriers.
Right. Look at those apostates getting all up in the world.
Maybe they're right.
There's all those horrible sinners have corrupted us.
Yes. So anyway, so I mentioned this, and some guy in the back raised his hand and he said, there is only one thing that kids need to know in order to be prepared for college. And he spoke in this authoritative voice that carried throughout this auditorium, this big church auditorium. And that one thing is Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, and the fall. And there was this, you know, this big
really
scattering applause from around the auditorium, and I thought, oh shit, I am in the wrong place. What do I say to that? Because that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's the only thing you need to know to prepare you for college. Okay.
Yep.
And so I just was like, all right, obviously what I want to say is not welcome here. So I'm going to like stay on stage and get through this and leave.
Sure.
But anyway, back to, that was certainly not mom and dad's attitude, you know.
Right. No.
Our dad's a scientist, and one of the things mom and dad always taught us was that you didn't read everything in the Bible literally. So for example,
no, not that.
And
I think it's that whole thing with the reading the Bible literally gets so, it's just like anybody who says they read the Bible literally, all you have to do is just start pointing out verses that they don't want to read literally. And then they, of course, are like, well, they don't really mean it literally. And you're like, but you said you read the Bible literally. Like,
Can you think of an example?
Well, I'm also...
Fornicators should have their heads cut off or be stoned or something, right?
Yeah, you should stone, like, you really want to go out and stone adulterers, like, in public, like, you want to be the person to pick up that stone and throw it at them, like, right now. That is in the Old Testament. But then they are like, oh, but that was the Old Testament, now we have the New Testament. And I'm like, okay, so that means the Old Testament. So now you're getting to pick and choose what of the Old Testament no longer has value and what does, right? According to your own cultural viewpoint. Because if I said, oh, yeah, that's right, you don't have to follow the 10 Commandments. Those were all in the Old Testament, man. And Jesus came to obliterate the law. And they'd be like, oh, you have to follow all of the 10 Commandments because they're the 10 Commandments. I'm like, okay, let's go stone some adulterers. Not that that's in the 10 Commandments, but that's part of the law of the Old Testament that you would find in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and whatnot. So yeah, like the instant we start talking about taking the Bible literally, then it gets really hard because then you have to cover your head. You know, even in the New Testament, like women have to have their heads covered, and who covers their heads anymore?
Well,
And
some fundamentalists,
you know, some do,
right?
some do, very few of them, and it's a really hard way to live, you know. But I'm just saying, like, most evangelicals who take the Bible literally don't take the Bible literally, but that's a whole nother thing. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to get off on that because I don't really want to talk about other evangelicals in this big thing. I want to talk about us and our experiences because like you can, the straw man is easy. It's easy to burn a straw man. It's so easy to set it up and burn it down, but this is our experience. So let's get back to your experience as a 12-year-old and like how that shaped you up or somewhere in that range and how that shaped you into your teen years and moving forward.
So, you know, in a lot of ways, I got super religious after high school. And in high school, so 12 to 16, because I started college at 16. So, you know, 12-ish to 16 or 11 to 16, I was being homeschooled. And I was, you know, in this kind of isolated religious culture. And my son's there. Sorry, I'm being distracted. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed during those years was that our older brother started taking his faith really, really seriously. And it made me feel guilty. You know, he was filling reams of notebooks with prayer. And so I started keeping a journal, and it's not to say that I was competing with Eric, but maybe I was. But I did start keeping a journal during that time, and I have all those journals. I've never wanted to go back and really read them because I'm afraid I would be horribly embarrassed. They weren't like daily journals of this is what I did or whatever. They're more like they're prayers. And so they're whatever the concerns of my heart were at the time. It's really hard not to slip into religious language when you're talking about this.
Sure.
The deep concerns of my heart. And so I did start keeping this kind of prayer journal / notebook during those years, probably more closer to the later years towards going to college. And I think that I was in a lot of ways looking to Eric as a model because Eric and I had a pretty horrible relationship up until the teen years. And we were enemies in a lot of ways. I'm going to close this other door because I hear my son's audiobook. I don't know if the rest of you can hear it, but
no, we can't hear it. Okay. So you're all good. It's a good.
You know, we were pretty antagonistic towards each other, and one of the things that actually the three of us being homeschooled allowed us to do with the guidance of our mother was heal those sibling relationships. Again, another thing that I'm very grateful for. And to be perfectly honest, I honestly think a big part of that has to do with Eric. Because Eric at that time, and to this day, he really at that time sort of took a hold of the teachings of Jesus, all the best ones, you know, and took them seriously and changed. He became a really wonderful, amazing person, which he is to this day. And as a result, he really started treating me differently. I like to think that I also did, you know, did
Right.
the same. But I think a lot of it was me responding to this change of heart in him, and so we healed a lot of that relationship. And so I think that there was a big part of me that was very influenced by the very real change that I saw in him, and the serious person of faith that he became. And so I think I was in many ways emulating that a little bit, and emulating our mom, and trying to live up to the standards that they set for me, that I saw every day. And so, and as part of homeschool, I mean, that was part of what, our daily curriculum was, we would, as a family, mom would have, a daily kind of scripture lesson with us. We memorized scripture.
Yeah.
We memorized songs and sang them together. Remember learning the Tallis canon? And the three of us would sing it in harmony.
Sure.
Or in rotation. You don't remember that?
No, but that's all right.
Maybe at another time when I'm less embarrassed, I'll sing it for you. No. But the Tallis canon is, there were the hymns that we memorized and sang together as a family.
Yeah.
This makes us sound really cheesy, and we were, but it was lovely and warm-hearted.
Sure.
And I will say too that one of the things that I appreciated, I mean, on the one hand, the curriculum was like very oriented towards making us deep, strong people of faith.
Right.
And on the other hand, mom and dad did not kind of universally just accept, oh, this is Christian curriculum, therefore it's good.
Right.
There were these Abeka science books that mom initially ordered, and dad read through them, and he was like, these are not good. We cannot have our children be learning science from these. They are twisting sources out of context. They're lying. They're,
Right.
And they were transparent about that with us too. It wasn't like they had these little conversations and said, we just won't expose them to. They would say, yeah, look, I mean, here's the Abeka science textbook trying to present young Earth theories, and this is what all the problems are with what they're presenting. Here's the distortions. Here's what they're omitting. Here's and so, but at the same token, certainly like my history textbooks were very oriented. I think we still use the Abeka history textbooks because on the one hand, because dad is a geologist, they really could see the problems with the perspective in those science textbooks, but they didn't have the same perspective perhaps on the history textbooks.
Sure.
And so the history textbooks were very much, I think, oriented towards this America as,
an ordained city on a hill, right?
Ordained city on a hill. White Europeans.
The nations.
Absolutely.
If they stay in the will of God, if we are a godly nation, then we will be blessed. And yes, this stuff was like
part of your education too.
Yeah, blatantly part of the education.
Yeah. And so now, I started
how all the founding fathers were deeply devoted Christians.
Right.
And that's why we have such a great Christian nation today. And if you deny that, then you're denying the truth about America. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yes. Now I started college at 16 and I started taking history classes right away. I was very, sort of instantly attracted to history, and was throughout my teen years too. And, later I went on to get a couple graduate degrees in history. So I think that obviously I went to a secular university and was exposed to other interpretations, but I don't know exactly how so many of that during my college years still kind of glossed kind of like,
right,
sort of like water off a duck's back. It just kind of, you
right.
know. And then too, though, I don't think that they were necessarily presenting all the kind of radical
But
reinterpretations of
right,
history that are being presented today at
right.
that
But then
time.
also, I think there's a big difference because I know a lot of evangelicals were that when they started hearing about like really in-depth like history and stuff, it really caused serious cracks in their Christianity because it was like orthodox for them that like this is the way it is, and if you don't, and so like there is truth and then they're they're secular everything else, and so when they started seeing this truth that I've been told is a truth is actually a lie, that really starts crumbling the whole thing. And I think for us it was a little bit different because we did have this idea that like there is real science, right?
Right. Keep
And so
talking.
yeah, there is real science, and then also I think the other and that like there's people who have a certain viewpoint and they're going to make an argument that's totally not true, and but we can see that that's not true and we don't have to follow that, but that doesn't mean that our Christianity is totally false and bad and wrong. And I think it's the same with some of these other ideas too. We're a little able to ignore them with the caveat that like they're they're we weren't as strict, I think, even though our practice was very devout, our actual interpretation of evangelical Christianity wasn't quite as strict as some people's. And so we were able to kind of throw some of that off in college with the idea that, yeah, whatever, yeah, what I was taught may not be 100% correct, but the core of it's correct, right? Which I
Right.
don't know is worse, right? Which is worse to 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 be like, okay, the peripheral may not be true, and I understand that, but the core of what I believe is true. I think there's good and bad to that both, but I think that's why for us, like going to college didn't the cracks. I'll tell you about the cracks that happened to me later, but so anyways, let's continue now that you're back.
Yeah. Yeah. And the cracks happened to me later too. And we're not going to necessarily get into that so much now, but I guess all of this to say is that very much so the education was orienting me towards a particular worldview, even though at the same time, sure, we we read books on reason, and not some of the horrible books on reason and Christianity, but definitely some of the better books. Mere Christianity is a lot better than Josh McDowell's book on apologetics. So, and Mom didn't try and expose us necessarily to the Josh McDowell version, but rather to the C.S. Lewis one. And I'm not trying to posit that as like this amazing, most wonderful book of all, but it really had, much better thought out propositions than some of the other ones. And so we definitely were encouraged to explore and understand other worldviews. In fact, that was part of my curriculum at 14 and 15, because I started asking questions and I felt a deep angst about my faith and whether this was true or not. And so Mom definitely encouraged me to read about. Now, the books that I read during this time were definitely coming from a Christian apologetics viewpoint. But nevertheless, I read about different worldviews and explored those things and really tried to grapple with whether this was the truth with a capital T on
So
both the and truth.
I just have a question for you, Ray. Just did you ever feel like deep down, like feel all the way through your being that you knew the truth, capital T, even with all this study, or did that? Yeah, I'm just curious. Did you ever come to a point where you really felt like this is truth with a capital T, or were you always like, I hope this is truth with a capital T?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I think you know, in my early 20s, around the time that I started to leave the church, I started watching the X-Files, and there's that poster, the I want to believe and the truth is out there. I think there's
Right.
two different posters, if I'm recalling right.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's much more and I really, I think, embraced those two sayings. I want to believe, and the truth is out there. Now, a lot of that, the angst that caused me to embrace those two sayings has left me a long time ago.
Right.
So I can say I don't know if I want to believe anymore. Sometimes I do, but most of the time, And then the truth is out there. I don't know. Is it? I want to think that the truth is out there, but I just don't know anymore. And so I feel I don't have the angst that I did at that time. But I really had a lot of angst, and I wanted it to be true, because for it not to be true meant, and it was almost a decade before I actually faced the reality of leaving that community of faith, of the betrayal that the people felt when I left, and how they responded and reacted to me, but also all the things that they had done that caused me to, I have to get the hell out of here. So, and I don't think they're even remotely like realize all of those things. But at 14, I felt that same angst. So I would say I felt an angst for about 9 years, from about 14 to 23, when I actually started to leave. And the angst continued beyond that, but it was just a different kind of angst. And so I'm not sure, I really tried to embrace it, and I did fully embrace the life of being a Christian.
Sure.
From about 15 to 22. And I was full on, and I do know I was full on, and in really some very unhealthy ways, which we'll get into later.
Yeah. I mean, I have some stories about that. Do you have any particular story?
Well, I do, but I'll get into the early adulthood later. But I'll just say, like, for example, in the really unhealthy ways, I mean, I totally bought this idea that I was a soldier of God. And, I bought into that kind of mindset of, and if you want to draw your little diagram again, go ahead. This might be a useful time. But I bought
you keep talking.
I bought into this, notion of that the earth was a battleground, and that you were a soldier, and either you were a soldier for the evil side, or you were a soldier for truth and goodness and light, which was, Jesus and God and Christianity. And when I say, like, I really embraced that idea in a really unhealthy way, I mean, it even affected me physically, in the sense that in my early 20s, I was running a lot and really limiting my caloric intake, because I was sort of sold on this notion of being physically as fit as a soldier should be, as much as emotionally and spiritually fit as a soldier should be. And we'll return to that later, because that's all in that time period that things came crashing down for me too. But when I say that I really embraced things in an unhealthy way, that's just the example that comes to mind. And there we go.
I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, there we have. The world is about to go either towards God or towards the devil, and you're human, and every action that you do will either help God or will help the devil. There's nothing neutral in this life, and that's a evangelical truth. Yeah, no,
the other drawing that you could do, of course, is the earth as this big battlefield, right? And everybody's soldiers. But anyway, from 14 to 15 or so, I felt a lot of angst, and I ultimately, kind of chose to be a Christian. And I remember saying to Mom, I feel like I should be really rebellious, like that would be more true because I don't know the truth and I should be acting out. And she was like, well, do you really think that that's going to get you closer to the truth? Or do you think that
Right.
is that what you really feel deep down inside is the truth? Is to be rebellious is therefore going to get you to the truth? And I remember thinking, no, not really. I didn't want to be rebellious. I really wanted this to be true
Right.
because, you know, for it not to be true was kind of devastating on a personal level in
Right.
terms of all the relationships that I had.
Sure.
So I embraced it. And then I went tootling off to college, and we can return to that later. Maybe now would be, do we want to hear about your
Well, I think
time doing that?
it's been about 40 minutes. So ask me that question you had, and then we'll continue. Because I think really, if you're out there listening and you want to hear like the cracks and really when things start to fall apart for us, it's when we get to college. And so we'll continue with Jessica in her college years and postgraduate years, but the things she did in college as a Christian, and the questions, and then her, you know, graduate, and when things really started to fall apart. So if you're interested, we'll go on, but this is set up that whole period, and then we can talk about my life in contrast and in parallel, you know, both of those things after that.
Right.
But what was that question you were going to ask me?
Well, you know, last week you talked about, and we had a comment about this, and you talked about the power that you felt, or not the power that you felt, but how powerful it was that when adults started taking you very seriously. And I guess I wanted to make a comment that I think we should do that for kids in society, as parents, as teachers and educators, as camp leaders, as scout leaders, as dance instructors, as, you know, that's something we really should offer kids, and we don't as a society.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting that in this subculture that is offered, and
or it can be. It wasn't offered to everyone. First off, I'm not going to say, but it was offered to me for whatever reasons, and it was not offered to everyone. It was offered to me and others like me, but not necessarily to everyone. And I just, with a warning, I think we do have that. I think often it's important. It was important for me. I had all these Christians who took me seriously as a Christian and stuff, and then I had this one example, my art teacher, who took me seriously, but as just a person, had nothing to do with Christianity. Just like, oh, I like that idea, you should pursue it, you know, that's interesting, let's do that, you know. And that was critical, really helpful for me, especially later on, that feeling of like, my ideas matter, they're good ideas and they matter. And so I think we can do that, definitely. I think it helps to have your parents take that seriously, but what helps even more, I think, often, is if you can get your kids into situations where they have true good relationships with other adults, where the other adults take them seriously. Because it's one thing, you know, within the family, we often can blow things off by being like, oh, that's just my mom, or that's just my dad. Whether they take you seriously or not, it's easy to blow it off. Whereas much it's much harder to blow off an adult out there who's not your parents. It's that, you know. So I think that's encouraging those relationships. And as you say, you know, when you come across somebody that you feel, it can't just be some random person that you have no connection with. There has to be a true relationship and connection with that person. And the more you can develop that, one, as an adult with a child or a teen, I think that's healthy for them. And then vice versa. If you have kids, if you can encourage your kids to have those types of relationships with adults that really have that spark or that thing, I think that's critical, because it's easy. You as an adult, me as an adult, it's hard enough, even though we were in a great loving family relationship, and great, you know, in a lot of ways, really phenomenal growing up, period, to be able to be like, this is my idea and I'm going to execute it and do it, right? And have that faith in yourself. it's hard enough for us to do that. It's doubly hard for some, or triply hard, or almost impossible for a kid who's never had anybody believe in them. It's never been there to say, yeah, what you think matters does matter. You matter. And so because you matter, your ideas matter.
Yeah. And I think, beyond the thought of what we should be doing for our kids is the reminder that we need to do that for kids that we know.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right.
And it may be one that just passes through your life in a brief period, but offering them the respect as that they deserve as a human being is, I think, important.
Yeah.
So any things you want to leave the conversation,
that whole idea, I have just one thought, and I'd like to expand on this later, but that whole idea, you were saying I was a warrior for God, and the whole idea of war and violence and the evangelical and just violence in general, and war and real the false idea of masculinity, and that's the overpowering strength, and that causing things to happen to your will is integral, and I think and is absolutely vital to the evangelical culture, and is championed, and is a reason why I believe so many evangelicals are hawkish conservatives and believe in war and believe in violence, and they won't let their kids watch a rated R program that might have some sort of romantical sex type scene in it, but they have no problems with their kids watching Braveheart or watching some incredibly violent and disturbingly violent movies at that, if you really get down to thinking about, like, is this really something we want to be championing in this day and age? And yet I think it's because it's historically part of evangelical Christianity, and it's and it's something that they would have a really hard time theologically extracting themselves from, just the way the culture works. So and so it's no wonder that you were thinking of, I have to be a warrior for God, and that whole prayer warrior thing that was going on with those. I don't even remember what those books were called, but there was these books about like angels and demons, and how if you prayed, somehow that would help the angels overcome the demons. And it was, these like kind of adventure type stories. And do you remember those, what I'm talking about? Anyways, that whole idea.
I remember. I can't remember who wrote them. Sorry. I'm having this whole side conversation with my son because he's hungry. I actually do remember, and I have to look them up. Later, there was the Left Behind series, which I never read.
That was much later.
This was
way before that. This was in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And anyways, I just want to make a point that I think it's that whole idea of being violent is being okay to overcome evil by power, and by showing power, and by having power, and then having the guts to use it. And so I think that's part of the evangelical Christian theology and culture. And so it's no wonder that you had that in your head, and that we had that in our head, and that like we that the culture gravitates towards dictatorial strongmen type people, and want to see somebody come in and say, no, Roe v. Wade is wrong, and we are going to use our power to make it, go away by pushing our people into places of power. So I see that as very much a part of the theology and culture of evangelicalism, starting with a God who would throw Adam and Eve out and destroy whole ethnic groups, because he's giving it giving the land to the Jewish people. And so how can you be a pacifist in that culture?
Although there are Christian pacifists, but
but most of them would not be, I think, as lovingly open-armed, like, come into our fold. Yes, you are evangelical. It's more like, what? You won't serve in the military? That's just like wrong. Like, that is not God's will for your life. God's will is for you to be a Marine and to protect the United States, which is a city on a hill, so long as our president is an evangelical person that we agree with. Or even if they're not evangelical, at least they've said the sinner's prayer, or at least they're a strong man who's going to put those goddamn judges into the Supreme Court. Anyways.
Yeah. I am suspecting that all of this is coloring your view of current times, what's going on right now.
I know. I shouldn't get off on that. Again, it should be about our stories. Again, this is another straw man I can throw up, and then I can violently stab with my wit, because I'm so smart and witty. Yes, other people can poke holes in what I'm saying very easily, and that's fine. Yes, it is coloring it, and we should move on so that we can talk about our Christian lives and how, again, we didn't get around to the writing part this time, but hopefully we will next time. So
sounds good. All right. See you next time. I'm JL Powers.
I'm MA Powers.
We're brother and sisters, and we brother and sister.
Read the book, Broken Circle.
Yep, oh, hey, you're wearing your t-shirt.
I'm wearing my t-shirt. Yay. The award-winning Broken Circle.
Right. That's right. It's now an award-winning book.
All right.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.